Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Rhodes, and I serve as the Associate Vice President for Financial Aid here at Grand Valley State University, and I would like to welcome you to the second annual Thomas J. Bullock Memorial Lecture. We are honored to partner again with Arbor Circle. Today's event brings together students, professionals, peers, and community members to share knowledge, strengthen collaboration, and inspire ongoing innovation in recovery support. On behalf of GVSU and on behalf of my boss and Vice President of Enrollment Development and College Futures, who sends his regrets and couldn't be here today, Dr. Dante Truss, we thank you so much for joining us this morning and for your dedication to building a healthier, more connected community. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Kristen Gietzen, President and CEO of Arbor Circle.
Welcome again to the second annual Thomas J. Bullock Memorial Lecture. And thank you, Dr. Rhodes and Grand Valley, for hosting us today and continuing to be a great community partner in this important work. We are so grateful to gather today, and we want to acknowledge James and Barbara Haveman, who have made this event possible. Their commitment to strengthening recovery services in our community and honoring Tom Bullock's legacy allows us to come together and learn from one another. So a special thank you to Jim and Barb. Jim's decades of leadership in Michigan as a social worker, a policy leader, and long-standing Arbor Circle supporter have shaped the field and continue to inspire. To begin today's program, I'd like to welcome Jim Haveman to share a few remarks.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and welcome. And I just personally want to thank each one of you for the work that you do in the world of addiction and treatment and the creativity and the innovation that you have and what your agencies are doing. It just makes a real difference, and it warms our heart. Barb and I, my wife's in the back there, established. I want to tell you a little bit about Tom Bullock, but I also want to say that you're in a treat today with Jesse and Phil, both excellent speakers and renowned in their field of data and innovation and treatment. And I think you'll go away today with some new sense of what's going on in the field. One of the reasons Barb and I established 2 years ago the Tom Bullock Memorial Fund was to make sure something like this happens on an annual basis. You know, when I was director of Project Rehab, and I'll talk about that in a second, you know, we didn't know what cognitive therapy was about. We didn't know what medication-assisted therapy was about. We didn't know much about trauma. The field has changed so much, and it continues to change, especially with what we're learning about the brain and how addiction works and early identification tools and what we can do for kids and young people. So I just want to say that's one of the reasons why we established the fund. In 1968, a young man came to Grand Rapids from Chicago, Tom Bullock, with his wife Louise, with a 3-year-old daughter, because he was wanted for arrest in Chicago. He came to Grand Rapids as Tom Fleming, and he was a jewel thief. And he heard that jewelry stores in Grand Rapids didn't have any alarms, and so he thought this might be a good place to land. Well, he ended up in a group in 1968 that Bill Koister started. Bill was a psychologist in town, and they were working out of different homes, had some early support from LaGrave Avenue Christian Reformed Church and from the Kiwanis Club, and Tom got involved in that, and in about he kind of became a peer counselor. So in 1970, Project Rehab had about 3 staff. They were located at Eastern and Bates, and they hired him as a peer counselor in 1970. And then in 1971, I got the call, and I was a social worker at Bethany Christian Services doing foster care and adoption work. They said, "How would you like to come and work at Project Rehab?" And I, without asking my wife, I said yes, and I made the switch. I did the same thing, by the way, when I went to Iraq. I accepted that without talking to the family, and they suggested that maybe next time I do that, I talk to somebody. But he was a heroin addict, and he got involved in the groups. And so in 1971, I came along. I was like, welcome back, Cotter. I drove up to Eastern and Bates. I had my little MSW, to put on the wall, and I was in a suit. And I walked into the waiting room, and people just looked at me like, who is this? It was about 30 men and women, Black and Hispanic, who were addicted, who were involved in various groups. And you can about guess the feeling when a white guy walks in and said, I'm the co-director along with Tom Bullock. And the first newsletter they put out, because they had a resident newspaper, said, well, Haven makes $13,000 and Tom makes $9,000. How can they be co-directors? So that's how it kind of started. But let me tell you a little bit about what I learned while I was there. I learned that Project Rehab changed the trajectory of my life as a social worker and who I was and what I was to become in my career. Tom taught me about the streets of Grand Rapids. Tom was about 5'4", weighed about 130 pounds. He had a quiet demeanor, and he was very kind. He taught me to respect and understand the various cultures of our town. He taught me to stand up, to be tough when things get tough. He taught me about purpose and value and mission of an agency that we worked hard on putting together. How to handle criticism and threats, because in our business there's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of threats. He taught me about the importance of peers. I had an MSW degree, he had a PhD in street work, and we got along and became partners. I had an MSW from a Freudian school who never taught me anything about addiction, but I knew the issues of what treatment is all about. I learned that addiction can happen to anybody. I learned that recovery is rarely a straight line, and relapse and setbacks and small wins are important. I learned one thing that helped me in the rest of my career, that success is harder than handling failure. Sometimes we push people way too quick to be successful when they're not ready, and they always got that little thing on their shoulder saying you're not worthy, and we got to continue to work on that. I learned that shame and isolation feed addiction, that compassion and connection can help break it. I learned that trust must be rebuilt slowly. I learned that how to bravely handle the streets and the media and the stress. I learned that hope is fragile but essential to recovery. I learned about the mind of an addict and how it works. I learned that law enforcement can be good and they can be bad. I learned that data is vital to understand and how to plan. I learned that ism, racism, sexism, all the isms are very unfortunate in the treatment world and what people have to experience, and how to network with fundraisers and funders. I learned the power of peers. Delancey Street in San Francisco, when I went out to visit them, I couldn't get in because I had an MSW, but Tom could get in because he was a former addict. I learned that labels are toxic. They were formal years, and this was 20 years before I even became director of mental health and community health in the state of Michigan. So those are the years that just made a difference in my life. Great Lakes Recovery in the UP had its roots in Project Rehab through Larry Zimkowski, who went up there to start it. I learned how to manage polarities, that it's not or, it's and. I learned that it's tough work, and that's why I'm glad you're here today. In 1973, 2 years after I got there, Tom was murdered. He was murdered, and then they left a note in his body, Jim, you're next. So it was a tough time in the history of Project Rehab, and what we had to do, he died at age 42. And 50 years later, Barb and I decided that 2 years ago that we would start this fund. And so we funded it, Barb and I, and we continue to contribute to it, and others do as well. So this would be something that can go on forever, that people can get together on an annual basis and learn new tools, new techniques. How does this relate to integration of care? How does it work with chronic care? How does it relate to justice issues? How does it relate to partnerships? How does it relate to funders, new ways of funding? We're still funding substance abuse in an old model, fee for service. There's a better way to do this, but we got to work on it together. So I just want to thank you for coming. We have a long ways to go, but I'm really encouraged just when I walk around the room and I see the enthusiasm and the interest and the commitment that each one of you has to really make a difference in your agencies and the people you're working with. And I just want to thank you for that. And Barb and I really appreciate who you are and what you are. And we want to let you know that we see you. So thank you very much.
Our first presenter today is Jesse Heffernan, a nationally recognized, I better put my glasses on, sorry. Nationally recognized recovery advocate and behavioral health consultant with more than 24 years of experience building sustainable recovery and behavioral health systems. Jesse is the founder and director of strategy and outreach at Helios Recovery Services, where he provides consulting, training, and technical assistance to state agencies, national organizations, and community-driven initiatives. His work bridges public health, behavioral health, community-led systems, and always lifting up lived experience as essential expertise. His personal journey of healing and discovery fuels his passion for expanding access to recovery supports, advocating for policy change, and empowering individuals and organizations alike. Please join me in welcoming Jesse Heffernan.
Do we need to stop now and get refills on coffee and food? Because I'll just keep talking and we're going to be like, give us a break. Let us do something else. Now's your chance, or just you're going to have to wait for like an hour and a half, right? All right. So good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you so much to Arbor Circle and Hefferman's for funding this and then for inviting me to be here today. I really appreciate it. Let's give them a round of applause again. I'm so glad that he came up here to talk about the legacy of Thomas Bullock and the kind of work that this is funding. I was a little worried about my slide deck and be like, am I pushing a little too much? And then he came up here and spoke about some of the things about what we need to address, some of the inequities, some of the problems, some of the systems failures that we still have today. So I'm like, oh, good. I can stop editing it last minute while I sat over there. That's going to be fun. So I was able to read a little bit about Thomas and find out and then through the story this morning about his legacy and what he did, right? And I think it's so important when we know about legacies like that, and granted, there are a lot of folks that we've all worked with who we could say, this person could be in a place where maybe we recognize them and continue to work in their name. But when you have that, and then you have someone in the community fund that, and then you all come in here knowing that that's what the legacy is, those things are really important to me as well, that we remember that history, that we remember those people that came before us, that paved the way in these institutions, in our communities and things like that. It reminds me of, the peer services movement and where that all started with deinstitutionalized individuals, right? And ultimately creating recovery coaches and peers. So again, I'm grateful to have that. Okay, this is not working the way I thought it would. I like to narrate, as I'm going, what's happening up here. So that's just part of what I'm understanding is like the ADHD and the nervousness a little bit, and just being like, by the way, I have this new teleprompter app that I just got, and we're all going to try it out together today as I go throughout all of this. So as was mentioned, I come here today as someone that's worked in the field for a little over 2 decades. I'm a person in long-term recovery and what I also think of as discovery and healing throughout that journey as well. I like to say that my recovery is woven through not just my personal experience, but also within my professional experience. I learned very early on that if I'm not doing this work in here, right, me trying to do this work out here, it's not going to go very well, right? Oftentimes it can lead to projection, it can lead to all kinds of different things that aren't necessarily helpful to the movement, but I understand like everyone comes here through their own means, right? Sometimes it's a wound, sometimes it's impact from family or community. It can be any number of things. And so again, finding out what that is for us, for you, that's part of the invitation today too, is like, what am I doing in here? And I like the idea that was brought up earlier about like how data moves so many things, right? But I believe it has to be a balance between data and stories. It needs to be a balance between head and heart, right? I used to say, data can change minds, stories can change hearts. If you've ever been to a fundraiser or other events, you know that that's very true, right? You go up there and present some of it, but then you have those stories and those people come up and speak about what's true for them and their experience. This morning's lecture and presentation is called Building Belonging, Cultural Responsiveness, Recovery Ecosystems, and the Power of Story. In my experience in a little over 25 years, I've learned that it wasn't just about creative, inclusive spaces, but it's creating spaces where people belong. And I've had some opportunity to both help create those things, but also be inside some of those places where it felt like actual belonging and not just like we're going to open up a space for you and hopefully you can change and hopefully you can adjust to and attune to what's going on here, right, in a certain space, rather than that space creating the opportunity for belonging and what that is and how that's going to be different. Most importantly, we're going to talk about hope, because what I've learned in my years of recovery work is that communities around the world and the opportunities that I've had to share with them is that when there's that small pilot light of hope, that there's still opportunity to change, right? I worked with a recovery, I'm a recovery coach. I've been a recovery coach for a little over 10 years now through the CCAR model, which I know is used here in Michigan as well. One year I had a recovery who was having some difficulty with their substance use, right? They were continuing to use heroin and shoot up. They've had multiple overdoses. They were struggling with having a child and the child being not in their life all the time. And I remember I lived a few blocks away from him. He called me up one day. He's like, Jesse, I just need some clean needles today, right? And he's like, I don't want anything else. I don't need that recovery stuff right now. I don't need so on and so forth. I don't need to be lectured right now. I'm like, okay, but lecturing's what I'm really good at, so I'm going to have to put that on pause. I went over to his house and he handed me this Crown Royal bag with needles sticking out every which direction, right? That's the way that he was disposing of them and taking care of them. I took it, carefully set it inside a bucket and said, all right, I'll be back in a little bit. Went to our local needle exchange, brought those in, got to him and gave him some new ones. There are systems and there are things that would say, well, Jesse, are you enabling? Jesse, are you just like perpetuating, the pain and the discomfort that he has by bringing him those things? Whereas I like to land on the side of even 1 degree, like 0.1 degrees of change is recovery for him that day, right? That movement and understanding that he was willing to call up and say, I need clean needles today and I don't want anything else, right? And just to be able to sit there with that and know that that pilot light is still there. And that's what I think of when I think of hope, right? The pilot light still exists. And I know as a coach that I can help those skills be transferable into other areas of his life, right? If we did it here, what other places can we find success? Walk in with curiosity, walk in with inviting the person to look at these different areas and what they might be able to do with that. So as was mentioned, my name is Jesse. I really like saying that, again, I'm on this journey of not just recovery, but of healing and discovery. I learned, in the last few years about a lot of the things for me that stem from childhood traumas and different things like that. Like the substance use certainly was something that was difficult in my life for the time period that it happened. And those early years of recovery were really imperative. It helped me understand what those things meant, what addiction meant, what recovery can be. But I've learned probably like in the last decade or so, it's even more than that, right? Again, about going into that work in myself, finding therapy, finding out what those root causes are, what those traumas are, and digging from there as well. So it's that arc of also healing And then the discovery, right? I would have never pictured myself up here, 10 years ago, much less, talking in front of all of you. I've had some real cool opportunities in my life. Last year at this time, I was working for the federal government. I was behavioral health advisor here for 6 states in the upper Midwest. I believe my supervisor, Linda Zeller, was here last year, and I just messaged her, and I'm like, where are you? I thought you were going to be here. I put her in a panic a little bit. No. She was great. Definitely one of the best supervisors I ever had. So Helios Recovery Services, like I said, we've been around for a little over 10 years. We try to focus on supporting leaders, supporting communities, right? We want to build responsible, thriving individuals and communities. And we feel that the best way to do that is through teaching about servant leadership, cultural humility, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and something called healing-centered engagement. I also want to share our justice and equity statements from Helios and acknowledge that I know that these aren't always being used these days because of current climates, and I want to talk about some of those climates as well, right? But for us at Helios Recovery Services, we know that things like this are being flagged. We know things like this are going to possibly be brought into question and might even lose us consulting contracts, right? And yet here we stand on the side of history that that's okay. All right, we'll continue to do the things that we do. And as someone, as a white cisgender male, I get to do this, right? I've got some plot armor and I've got some protections around me that allow me to go and do these things as a former Fed and say, we still need to talk about these things. These things are still important to have on our website. These things are still important to bring into the presentations. So again, we acknowledge and honor the land that we operate and conduct our in-person and online trainings where participants join us as the traditional territory of First Nations people. And we express the gratitude to those folks that continue to steward the land. There we go. We also acknowledge that our country was built on a foundation deeply intertwined with slave labor, systemic inequities, and patriarchal structures. We recognize the ongoing impacts of these historical legacies which have perpetuated injustices on marginalized communities. And we believe through education, advocacy, and intentional actions, we can create a collective path forward that centers on justice, equality, and empowerment for all individuals. We're dedicated to fostering healing, dismantling systemic barriers, and cultivating a more just and equitable society for future generations. I didn't expect all that, but right on. I can dig it. So a lot of presentations talk about creating safe spaces. I think that's great. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume since you're here, there is some level of safety, right? Like you're amongst colleagues and peers, you kind of understand the social norms that we're all supposed to abide by, and that you can be here and hopefully listen and learn and maybe step outside that comfort zone a little bit into something I call a courageous space. And this is, something that encourages dialogue, even when it's difficult, recognizes difference not as something to overcome or ignore, but as a source of strength and learning. In a courageous space, we hold each person accountable to do the work, to share the experiences, to sit with discomfort, and to come to new understandings. And a lot of times that's hard, right? A lot of times it can be difficult to lean into that for a couple of reasons. One, because it's going to move me, maybe with all the different privileges that I have, it's going to move me out of my comfort zone, and I don't experience the same amount of emotional labor that other folks do. And for other folks, maybe it's like, I'm tired and I don't want to do all that emotional labor today or hold someone else accountable. And that's fine too, right? It's about what's understanding what's going on in here and what those invitations are, and doing it in a way of calling people in, not calling them out. So what I ask today is that we engage in self-reflection and self-critique. We bring into check power imbalances. We assess new cultural dimensions of each person's experience. Relinquish the role of expert. Challenge yourself to identify with your own values as not the norm, right? And become comfortable with the idea there are things you don't know that you don't know, and to be okay with no closure. And for me, that's a really difficult one, right? To just be able to sit there and there's no closure, there's no finality on a topic or a situation, just like What does it mean to sit with something open-ended? What does it mean to sit in a space locally, right, in the county, in the state, federally, where there's just unknowns abound, where we don't know what the direction is going to be tomorrow, much less in 3 minutes from now, because there might be another post about something that happened, right? All these things are continuously inundating us. And to have the ability to sit here and slow down a little bit and say we're going to be intentional about this work is really important. Today we're going to explore equity, culture, and story, how systemic oppression shapes access to recovery services, use storytelling as a tool for restoration, foster belonging through culturally responsive practices, move beyond one-size-fits-all recovery models, learn actionable strategies for cultural humility and practice, build recovery ecosystems rooted in dignity, learn from global models of community-led healing, uplift the power of lived experience and peer support, understand inclusion versus belonging, define the distinction between being invited and being valued, examine structural change required for true belonging, and apply belonging frameworks to your own communities. There will be opportunities to, we're going to have some small group work, and there is some papers that are on there, and I'm going to be asking you to have this little bit more interactive part today. So again, like I can sit up here and talk, and I know like adult theory, right? Like you're going to remember the first 15 minutes and the last 15 minutes, and everything in between may or may not stick, depending upon your notes, right? I'm sure we'll be able to get you these slides, and there'll be hundreds of views on the YouTube video once this goes up, and being like, oh, I forgot all about what he said, so I'm going to do that. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. I want you to just sit with that a moment. Think about what that means to you. Does it sit in a space that you're used to thinking about this work? Does it challenge it a little bit? So these words were shared with me originally at a conference in 2017 called Wisdom 2.0. They bring in a bunch of folks from the tech world and a bunch of folks from the meditation and mindfulness world, and somehow seamlessly combine it really well. There was a panel of these 4 individuals from the East Bay Meditation Center. It's a meditation center located in inner-city Oakland, and they're talking about how their work and everything like that was doing some resistance work and doing the things to help the community. And then what would happen after folks shared, the panelists would come into like a room like this, right? And they'd do Q&A with the groups. And so in 2017, unlike now, I was super humble, super culturally minded, very grounded in all the amazing allyship work that I've done. I had been working at that point. I had worked for a place called Harmony Cafe. It was a program of Goodwill Industries over in Wisconsin. So I served as a program leader for youth LGBTQ services for a little over 10 years and helped develop a bunch of systems with schools in Northeast Wisconsin. So when these folks came in, I had the best question, right? I had this question preloaded for them, and I'm like, I'm going to say this. And then next thing you know, they're going to be asking me to keynote next year. And like my insightfulness is just, like, you know, I just had the audacity, right, of like a mediocre white man that understands all these things and is going to go in there and change some stuff. So naturally I did, right? I went in there and I said, you know, as an ally and as someone who has worked with folks for so long, what can I continue to do to help communities? And, you know, I probably put some things in there about communities of color. Like I did all these things, right? I said, write all the right words. And gratefully it was 2017 and no one was filming it. So that's a plus. And then I had like the, you know, I'd like, yep, that's right. I just got it. You know, I nailed it. And so gratefully, there was someone there that, and I'm trying to find her name in all this, but I keep missing it. Regardless, one of the speakers said to me, she said, stop it with all this ally nonsense. I'm like, no, right? Like in that moment, like everything come crashing down, like, oh, she's going to say something smarter than me. Of course she is. Continuing to use allyship says that there's a have and have not. Continuing to use allyship is continuing to perpetuate power structures, right? Continuing to say allyship means like, I'm already good, right? And how are you doing? What can I do to help you, right? It's a continued separation. It's a continued thing to say, like, I don't have to be in that spot. And as someone, especially someone with privilege, I get to move out of discomfort whenever I want to, right? I could easily abandon these things. I could easily step out of doing the work that I'm doing. I could easily not have justice and equity statements up there because it's uncomfortable, right? And so she invited me to like drop the allyship piece, right? And that's where I heard the quote, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. And it took me a while to even understand it after that, right? Because immediately my feelings were hurt because again, like I thought it was going to be a big deal. I had to manage my own feelings, as fragile as they are, and realize that, again, it was an invitation, right? And I was in San Francisco and no one was ever going to see me again, so I was like, okay, at least I'm not embarrassed in front of all these folks. But it sat with me for a while. And it was an uncomfortable feeling even years afterwards, right? Like, what does it mean to truly just let go of this idea that I'm going to help people or change people from this mentality that I'm going to be the one that makes the difference, right? It was this humbling, truly humbling piece of like, maybe I need to sit back a little bit. Maybe I need to reassess even the materials, the recovery coach trainings that I'm providing. Maybe I need to reassess all the different approaches. At that time, I was a program director for peer-run respite in Wisconsin. I don't remember, do you all have peer-run respites here? Kind of, sort of, a model like that? You do? So, sort of? So in Wisconsin, peer-run respites are these facilities, completely volunteer, by the way, which is super important, right? So anyone experiencing emotional, mental health, or substance use crisis can call up the peer respite and say, I need a place to stay that's non-institutional, right? It was our state's way of not putting folks into 72-hour holds because we knew that that was devastating, and oftentimes they would continue to go there every 6 months because their actual needs weren't being met. And so as the director there at the time and then going to this, and even as folks were coming into that peer respite and learning more about like the non-hierarchical, non-power structures of peer services and sitting inside there, right? When folks came in, it wasn't that I was the director there to help them, is how can we create a space for you? We didn't have clients or consumers, we had guests, right? And what do you do when you invite guests over to your house, right? Do you treat them like, hey, you're coming in and you're not doing this the best, or, like, if you could just follow these rules exactly kind of a thing, right? No, when we bring guests in, we welcome them, right? We make accommodations for them, right? We make them feel like they belong. We went beyond what we could to make sure that people felt that. At one point, we were going to even have someone come in from a realty business and just do like, what does a 360 tour look like of this place so you can experience it before you come in? What are the staff's names and their likes and all those kind of things, right? So again, that understanding that every person who came in there, that their liberation or that their healing was bound with mine was important because those were community members. They weren't just statistics, right? They were community members who I would see downtown, who I would see in meetings, who I'd see in different places. I knew, again, like if I could connect with that we'd have an opportunity for them to have some healing, right? And we'd have an opportunity for the community to heal a little bit as well. Unfortunately, we still find ourselves, maybe more so, in a place of crisis. Last year, it was announced that the opioid overdose rate, the fatalities, had decreased by 10%, right? And at SAMHSA, where I don't know if I mentioned I was at SAMHSA, but I just said a regional office. So at SAMHSA, this was a big deal, right? We were like, this is great. We can't wait to get this out there. We were getting all the information in the regional offices prior to about press releases and different things like that. And truth be told, I was pretty excited about it as well. I was like, this is great, right? We haven't seen this kind of a thing in years. We even talked about decline at all. It was only a matter of a few hours where other folks within the different offices also pointed out that this wasn't true for everybody. This wasn't true for every community, right? We work with 34 tribes within the upper Midwest region here. This wasn't their experience, right? And so how did we have that conversation? How do we continue to talk about those things and the disparities that were continuing to happen? When nationally and publicly, we had this huge piece, about 10% decrease, but we still had to go in there with the rooted data that, again, this wasn't happening everywhere. And why is that, right? Why is that? Is it intentional? Is it structural, right? These were the questions that we had to continue to ask and that we would talk about within our regional offices in SAMHSA as well. And one of the things before I started working there, SAMHSA held an event where a lot of us came in. It was about before the Office of Recovery was started. I think it was like 2022. And brought in a bunch of peers and recovery coaches and just folks within that industry to help, is SAMHSA's definition of recovery still really working, and so on and so forth. In one of our breakouts, we continue to talk about the systematic inequities that were happening and how SAMHSA can address those things. And at that point, I had asked, so can a administration, right, like SAMHSA, who's intertwined with all the other agencies in the federal government, and those other agencies who have very directly impacted communities across the country, right? The FBI, we think about, what's that? I forget the name of the movie, but The People versus Billie Holiday, right? Like where the drug war came from, right? And talking about how it was specifically targeted to Black and Latino communities. And again, that happened within our federal government. And there's that movie, the People versus Billie Holiday. I invite you to take a look at that. Or there's Johan Hari's book, Chasing the Scream. So I asked, how can we as a federal system who are intertwined with those things truly rebuild or truly do something inside of it if we're still connected to all of that, right? There was no easy answer that was given right away. There still isn't, right? And at that time I thought, well, what if we just started all over and tore it all down? And I think we're kind of seeing maybe what that could look like, but on the other side, right? So continuing to ask those questions, are our agencies and organizations that are connected, right, to the systems that continue to structurally, right, like leave people out or not provide them accountability or provide them with services, how are we connected to them and what are we doing differently? How can we continue to question and ask those folks what they got going on? So we also saw similar rates of mental illness as white populations, but much lower access, higher rates of unmet needs, misdiagnosis, and poorer health outcomes for communities of color. LGBTQ individuals face significantly higher prevalence of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. So these things haven't gone away just because we've stopped talking about them, and I'm not going to assume that you've all stopped talking about them. I really put this out there because I want to make sure that the conversation is continuing to happen, that we know that we can say these things, and that when we continue to fund events and do events like this is the places where we can talk about them, because it might not be the safest thing out there all the time. We're still continuing to feel the impacts of COVID-19, right? That time period that impacted all of us, all of our communities, impacted the service structure, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Continue to impact people's mental health and their ability to navigate systems. And so during the pandemic, our agency, Helios Recovery Services, we were trying to work with the places that were building, what could we do across the borders of our states, right? How does insurance move across, right? How are we talking to the folks who are still, in their houses afraid to leave? And one of the things I saw early on in the pandemic, which I thought was incredible and really speaks to the ability for the recovery community to adapt, was the amount of meetings that immediately moved into online, right? It was fast, right? I saw the recovery community specifically adapt to what was needed and build supports almost overnight. If you're not familiar, there's an organization called In the Rooms. Have you heard of In the Rooms before? intherooms.com, right? So they host, at the time, it was like 125 online recovery meetings, right? Talking to Kenny and RT, who run it, they saw a boom in their membership, within those couple years of the pandemic. And what I saw was people reaching out at a level that they never did before, going into those things. And I hosted a meeting in the rooms for a little bit, specifically for recovery coaches and peers. And again, we had folks coming in there too. What can I do differently? How can I attune? How can I adjust to folks that are experiencing these things? And as what was expected of us throughout the pandemic shifted sometimes, right? It also left us in a state of like, how do we continue to move into those places to connect with folks, even though those things are moving? We continue to see a treatment access gap when it comes to equity. I think for me, the important part about this slide when we talk about like who has access and who doesn't, and that the numbers continue to substantiate this, is what has happened in the last 4 years, where we had an administration, where we had a community, where we could talk about these things more widely and still see some of these numbers. And now that we have an administration that's changed and we can talk about these things so openly, what are we going to do to continue to maintain, right? What are we going to do to continue to have the conversations? Prior to this administration coming in, at SAMHSA, we had to have a lot of tough conversations in November, right? We said, look, what are we going to do about harm reduction? Immediately, we started thinking about like, what names are we going to use? What words are we going to use or suggest at that time as we knew that they were coming in, right? We immediately had to talk about, well, we can't talk about diverse communities or communities of color. We're going to have to go back to the 80s, right, and talk about like urban communities, and we're going to have to talk about, rural communities in this different way, right? And so we knew that we had to switch that up. And as we saw throughout the last almost year now, right, a lot of that language was removed. We sat there in February as all of our LGBTQ resources, BIPOC resources removed from the website. Minute after minute, we refreshed the website and our materials were gone, right? Gratefully, there's folks that saved a lot of that. And we did too, right, at the regional office. We saved those things so we can continue to give them to you, right? So we can continue to look at the real data and the real information that supports the work that you're doing. So I want to go into trauma-informed care. And what I have found to be, and again, not limitations in the sense that it doesn't work for folks. I can certainly say when I learned about trauma-informed care and what it means, when was this? I think one of the parts that happened was in 2016. I was on the former Governor Walker's opioid task force. And what was great is that our task force would go around to different communities within Wisconsin, rural, urban, so on and so forth, and have speakers come in. And I'd heard the term before, but never really quite understood it to the degree I did when they came in. And I believe it was actually the First Lady, Scott Walker's wife, who came in and was trying to push initiatives for trauma-informed care and shared with me that, and the group, that this wasn't about what's wrong with you, this is about what happened to you. So as someone in recovery, learning that it was about what happened to me, right? And being able to look back throughout my childhood about instances and things that happen and be able to look at something like the ACEs and be like, oh, this explains so much more, right? This explains why I acted out the way I did. This explains why I sought out substances the way that I did. Explains the mental health issues and all those different things as I moved into recovery. It's really important to note that, again, this system, I think, has been extremely helpful, has moved me through a lot of things, and I've, used it within different areas. I think that the recovery coach trainings and a lot of the systems and trainings that we go through embody this pretty well, but I've also seen where it doesn't come through so well, right? It still has limitations. It still focuses on like individual what happened to you, not necessarily like community inequities. It doesn't necessarily focus on the other things that are happening within someone's life that maybe not be as blunt or as direct as what we see in some of the ACEs here. I had seen my former therapist for a number of years, and we had gotten to this point where I felt like, you go to therapy, you take care of what, like I say, like you take care of the elephants, right? Like this big significant event in life and this big significant event in life. and then maybe, maybe a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. But over time and over the years, I'm like, why do I still feel like when I go into a room, right, like all these things are happening? Why is that when this one thing happens, I'm activated and I feel like I'm experiencing that stuff all over again? She had attended a conference where this idea of the trauma absences were introduced. And so I invite you to think about these, like when folks are coming into your care, when folks are coming into your facilities, and we continue to talk about belonging, what kind of environments are we setting up, right? So failure to protect, failure to attune, failure to choose, and failure to stay. Failure to protect. I don't deserve to be safe or taken care of. I have to handle danger on my own, self-neglect, self-defense, right? So growing up, right, again, number of things happened. We don't need to get into details. Depending upon the ACEs catalog that you're using, sometimes I have 6, sometimes I have 7, sometimes I forget. But I realized that there was a failure to protect us growing up because, again, the environment, the adults who were supposed to be the safe adults didn't always show up, didn't always do the things that they needed to do. There weren't always environments in which I was protected. So what did I learn from that? I don't deserve to have protection, right? Or am I the one that has to provide it? Or am I going to seek out places that remind me of those things? So that failure to protect went deep. And one thing to remember about these trauma absences, I would say, like a lot of these things, like you'll see, like happen to people regularly on a regular basis. You might think of it as like regular stress versus toxic stress, right? But for folks that have experienced trauma, and again, like depending upon the number of ACEs, these things can act like wind on a raw nerve, right? These things can act as though they are currently happening to the person, and because they haven't necessarily addressed them or mitigated the harm that comes from them, they might be in a room or a space with you where this stuff feels like clear and present danger for them. Failure to attune. I pretend to be someone so you like me. I don't let myself feel my needs, the false self. When I was in middle school, I was not a very good student. I knew that there was undiagnosed ADHD. I knew there was stuff happening. I was struggling in classes. Again, we didn't have trauma-informed care at the time, so when I had conferences, oftentimes the questions are, what's wrong with you? They would ask my mom, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you able to take care of him, right? My mom at one point got me connected with a program called Big Pals program. It was through the county, out of Gaming County in Wisconsin, similar to Big Brothers, Big Sisters, right? An individual comes in, I went over to his house like every Sunday, watched Packer games. I think out of rebellion, I became a Cowboys fan just because I knew it was irritating for them. And, throughout school, especially when I got into middle school, like these things, like I just felt like I was constantly, like having all this energy trying to move through me. I constantly felt like I had to do something to manage my surroundings or do something so that I had some form of control. Even if that control was acting out or getting in trouble, right? I could still control it, right? I knew how to navigate chaos well. I knew how to navigate unpredicted situations very well because I could deal with the feelings that come with those things. And so my big pal, his name's Dave Miller, came over and he's like, hey, you need to get your grades up or you're not going to continue to move through school. And I was like, okay, so what are we going to do? And he offered, what do you want to do if you get your grades up to a C? Just a C, that's as far as you got to go. And so I wrote my wish list, right? Disney World, see a game, right, in Dallas. I just had this wish list, right? And he's like, okay, you get to the C and we'll do one of these. And he had the means to do it, right? And I was motivated. I was like ready to do some work. And within 2 weeks, I wasn't ready to do the work anymore, right? It was still difficult. I didn't understand the content. And then I also felt the weight of this, this promise that I made to try to get it up to a C. And so then I felt the failure and I avoided him for a while too as a result of that, right? So not only was there that difficulty in school, then there was also this difficulty of now I have to face him as a result of this. Having kids of my own now, which is great, I realized that it's that failure to attune, right? I didn't need promises, to something really big and grandeur, right? What I needed was a tutor, right? I needed someone to sit down with me every single day and explain it to the degree in which I could understand it so I could do these things, right? That's why I love AI, because I'm like, tell it to me like I'm 5, right? And it does. I mean, tell it to me like I'm a college grad, and it does, right? That's what I meant. I can teach it to attune to me. And so what I see now, especially with my kids when they struggle, is, again, like I can't go to them and be like, this is what I need you to do and how it needs to look. I understand there are expectations within school districts, and I also understand sometimes those school districts, kind of like our systems, don't attune to the needs of individuals, right? Have you ever seen the cartoon where it's got like a lion, a giraffe, a monkey, and a fish, and then there's a person at a desk and it says, okay, you all need to race, and whoever gets to the top of the tree first wins, right? In a lot of ways, that's our systems too, right? We're expecting all those folks with those different skill sets to achieve the same level of success in order for them to move on, in order for them to be, move through drug court, in order for them to do any number of things. We have a large failure when it comes to attunement within our systems, right? And sometimes that's not on us. I understand that. Sometimes that's on insurance companies saying like, we're only willing to pay for these kind of things, right? Sometimes it's on the lawmakers who say like, this is what the policies need to look like. Sometimes it's the certifying bodies who write the bylaws, right? Like I had to write bylaws for IC and RC. I understand the limitations that can come through that. I understand that certifications and licensure are meant to protect the public. And sometimes they move us out of that attunement to what folks really need. Failure to choose. I'm unworthy. I'm less important than what you've chosen. Self-doubt. This is a real one for me. So even just this weekend before coming here, right? One of our daughters who's had some difficulties, we've had some folks pass away in her life over the last few months. Her teacher last year, and then a close family friend. Mom and Dad were gone, this last weekend, celebrating my wife's birthday in Chicago. It was a blast. And then we were going to leave again, right? And she was struggling with it. And because I teach these things, or at least I try, because I talk about these things, I know that this is one of those pivotal moments of choice. What am I going to choose? Like she is waking up 2 or 3 times crying like she does not want us to go, right? How do you manage that? How do you tell the 10-year-old that I got to go do this, right? Made the commitment, so on and so forth. Gratefully, I have an amazing partner who was willing to stay back, right? She stayed, and we were able to mitigate some of that damage in that choice, right? But I remember time after time after time growing up where other things were chosen. Sometimes it was even the policies were chosen over what was best for me at the time. Sometimes it was other people or other places that were chosen over me. And so, again, that unworthiness feeling, there is some complicated stuff when it comes to calling it imposter syndrome and where that really came from to unpack. So I try not to use that term. But it certainly is something like that, right? This feeling of I don't have what it takes to be able to do these things. People constantly choose over me. I think this is where FOMO comes from sometimes too, the fear of missing out, right? Friends, family, people are choosing other things over us to go do those things. So again, as you look at these, think about like what is happening within your organizations and what are you doing and how are you choosing sometimes maybe policy, maybe rules, maybe something over someone's care. And failure to stay, right? I'm not enough. I wasn't worth sticking around for. Self-abandonment. And this for me is one of those core wounds where having a father who decided to be the one that left, right? I saw him a handful of times growing up. And in 2013, when he passed away, I was the one that was responsible for going out to South Dakota and taking care of all of his belongings, right? And that was a mixed bag of like some resentment and relief at the same time. It was also this feeling of like, how do you grieve a ghost, right? I know very little about him, so I was grieving all the stories I made up. I had to go through all of his belongings. I had to sit in a service for him where he was staying at it was a mission for folks that were experiencing homelessness, and person after person got up and talked about how amazing my dad was, how incredible he was, how he was served the community so well. And again, like it was one of those spots for me, I'm like sitting there like seething, right, with this frustration about like, well, you don't really know, do you? You don't know that he left my brother. And all these things. I wanted to make this case for it, and I wanted to go up there and burst everyone's bubble. And fortunately, I didn't. I just said, thanks for coming. We can go now, right? But knowing that it was his failure to stay, right? And he had opportunities when I was 20 years old, 21 years old, somewhere around there. My father was extradited back to Wisconsin for past child support. And at that time, I was in recovery. I was working at an organization called Step Industries, right? Step Industries had been around for a while. They hire people in recovery to do production packaging. We worked with a lot of just different products, putting together displays. And as I was working one day, my supervisor came up and he had asked, like, do you got room in your car for one more person? That's the context I was given, right? I'm like, maybe, right? I mean, it's a good way to get gas money. Sure, I'll bring someone in. We'll stuff them into my little Honda Accord. It'll be a clown car, but whatever. He's like, well, cool, because your dad's here, right? I'm like, oh, really? Thank you. Sure enough, and it was like this cinematic moment where he moved away and there he was. Someone I hadn't seen in a couple of years, right? Last time he was here, I was getting drunk with him and trying to like find this like way to bond with him that didn't go very well. And then there he was. New in my recovery, still pretty raw and fragile, right? I had actually gone through a weekend prior to that called the Accept Weekend, Adult Children of Alcoholics and Codependents. So I was like there, I'd written the letter and burned it and done all that stuff. But to actually see the person was a little bit different, right? It was a little bit different of a means, and I wish I would have been given a little bit more heads up. So I had this really interesting few months with my father where I felt this almost all the time, right? And it was like this time where he even got to get out from jail and attend family groups at the treatment center that I was at. And so here I was, again, like very new, my dad on one side, my mom on the other, and I'm attending family groups, completely unprepared. And to be fair, like I understood what the counselors were trying to do. Like it's a really big moment when you can say you forgive someone inside of one of those groups, right? And in a way, they were kind of inviting me maybe a little too much to get to that point of forgiveness, right? I even asked during it, one of the times he said, like, do you forgive me? And what am I going to say? No, right? In front of everybody there, like, nah, I'm not going to be that guy, right? I was still working on being a junior counselor better than the other residents at the time. So I had to make sure I was doing the best. And so I said it, right, as meaningful as I could, like, of course I do, right? Like, I'm just so glad you're here. And I was betraying myself at the moment, right? And I think that's another part of like, what are we asking folks to do? And are they saying yes because you're in the position of power? Are they saying yes because as voluntary as drug court is, it's really not voluntary? Are they saying yes because of the power structures that exist? Are we asking people to continuously betray themselves within their recovery journey so that they can get through the process that they're in? How would you go about asking folks that, right? How many folks here have had to deal with acknowledging their self-betrayal, right? When they said yes when they meant no, right? When they felt like they had to show up to something despite their safety being in danger. Because they knew if I don't show up, I could lose my job. If I don't show up and say it this way, right, I could be in trouble. How are we doing that to folks today, right? So, got through the family group, right? He came to a few more of them. We were working together at Step Industries. It was weird, right? Like, I was like still in this little kid mode, like trying, like a little puppy, right? Like I was like trying to get attention from dad the whole time. And he did the best he could, I guess. I knew he had gone to like multiple treatments. He had been in prison a number of times. He was like a real outlaw. He like escaped from prison a few times. And so I got to brag about that a little bit, which was cool, I guess. Kind of like outlaw adjacent, if you will, right? I've got felonies too, Dad. So then the day came where it was time for him to go back to South Dakota, right? So we go into one of the counselor's offices, myself, my younger brother, my mom, and him. And I'm feeling it, right? Like, I just had a few months with my dad, right? Like, I want this to continue to happen. And I was like, all right, like, can I get your phone number? And are you going to get a hold of me? It's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to use this phone. And all I can promise you is today. And I knew in that moment I'd never hear from him again. And I never did, right? He had come to Wisconsin. He had played the game he needed to play and said the things he needed to say, because at the end of the day, that's how he learned survival. And I can forgive him for that, right? He learned to survive that way. And at the end of his life, right, he was using his checks to primarily get a ton of alcohol and drink most of it away at the beginning of the month. And he died from kidney failure and seizures, right, from his alcohol use, right? But that's what he had to do, or so he felt, right? I can't imagine as someone, as a father of 4 kids, like how much I would have to do, right, in order to like escape the feeling of responsibility and love that I have for them. So was it right? Was it okay? No. Did he fail to stay? He did fail. He failed in a number of areas, right? And I understand it today. So we're going to do our first small group activity. And you are all going to come up with some questions about how you could ask or what you could do differently or say to these folks, or maybe some new messages, right, that people could introduce to themselves to kind of come against these a little bit, right? What can you say to your clients to replace the messages, right? Again, either questions, statements, whatever works for you. Maybe you have some reflections from some of the things that already came up. What did you need to hear if someone failed to stay or protect, right? So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, please. Everybody write down their own, maybe. Come up with 2 to 3 yourself, and then share them with the group. And I'll let you know when you got a couple minutes left, and then we'll hear from some tables. Does everybody understand what I'm asking? All right, you may start. We walked through some messages, some things that may have happened to folks, right? The trauma absences, the potential messages that could come with those, right? Knowing that those trauma absences, again, can happen to a lot of folks. People that may not have experienced any number of traumas or ACEs, like, might feel them too, but just not to the same degree, right? And so we know then, right, like, what are we doing to, adjust our practices? What are we doing to improve our environments, right? These are things that we can bring into the forefront and start creating some new ones. So let's hear from a few folks if you want to share the story with it, but how you came up with some ideas, some messages or questions that you could be asking that are specific to the trauma absences. I like that. Maybe there weren't times you weren't protected, but you are worthy of safety. That's great. Thank you. Others, what did your table talk about? Did you come up with any statements or questions to ask folks that you work with? So how do you build or create the environment where they can do that? And, what would you say then, like, okay, well, I'm doing the best that I can with it, but there's still things that, like, even inside here that don't allow me to do that. Like, how would you attune or adjust to that? For you and for anybody else, right? This is kind of like the interactive portion of the show. Yeah, celebrate the small victories, the little things, right? The idea and the concept of who I am, right, 20 years ago, and what I thought I was doing, even, in 2017 when I was that amazing ally, and I thought I was like being the most authentic me I could be, it's different now, right? I understand, like, a lot of that was performative, and a lot of that was masking, and a lot of it was all these different things, because for me, what a lot of those traumas did is I learned how to be a trauma chameleon. It worked really well for me to be able to fit in environments and figure out what I need to do really fast, right? And being able to watch that, sometimes I'd have like folks in the room that I could like run that by. Like, so when I was on that governor's task force, there was a friend of mine, she was a chief of staff for one of the reps, and I'm like, what am I doing here, right? Like, these are all judges and doctors, and like, they got all these letters after their last name. Like, this isn't my environment, right? And she's like, just stay and figure it out and, whatever, right? So she just invited me to be there. And it took almost to the last meeting where I finally felt comfortable enough to say things, but the idea was, how can I just sit there and realize that, like, it wasn't just an invitation for me, right? Sometimes my discomfort got in the way of the real work, right? I was there to represent folks in the community, right? So to find that place, to be worthy, to be able to do those things was really important. It took both the community support and it took finding it within. Other folks, messages, things that you can bring up, right? I have the right to be safe. How many folks in their agencies have like client or consumer like bills of rights that they have to look at? Yeah, a number of folks do, right? How many folks in your agencies have actually used that and have actually had to use that because they didn't feel safe? How did your agency handle that, right? Was it showmanship? Was it like, cool, you signed this thing and even you may have experienced something that didn't align with you in this environment? How do you address those things and attune to it? One of the things about, and this goes back to the introduction earlier, talking about the fund and talking about this event, that made me think of, like, again, what is the attunement piece and the systems piece when it comes to our structures? And so one of the things I've struggled with for a long time in this system is that the onus and the burden was always placed on the client when they didn't successfully complete treatment or something else, right? So my understanding, again, maybe limited, maybe not. When I moved into treatment, I was diagnosed with something from the DSM. I can't remember what it was, if it was cannabis specific or not. But anyway, I was medically diagnosed with something, right? And I was on probation, right? So I had some felonies, under my belt, and I went into this organization, into this treatment center with all that going on. And what I watched was people who were non-compliant. I watched people who didn't feel safe. I watched people who were expressing the very symptoms that got them there in the first place, being treated as though they shouldn't be doing those things while they're in that environment, right? One of the things about the Peer Run Respite that I loved is that when people came in, they felt safe enough to act out. They felt safe enough to be in a place where they could get some of that stuff out because they didn't have to act anymore, right? And so throughout the years, I have worked with a number of treatment facilities, and I would always ask, like, what is your protocol when someone's asked to leave? How do you follow up with them to get feedback from them to find out what you could have done better? Oftentimes they say, what does that mean? We don't know, right? We don't follow up with folks. They're gone. They're in the wind. They're not coming back, right? And I said, well, how much energy would it take to find them? Do you have contact info? Do you know where they're hanging out? So on and so forth, right? Do you know that they're safe right now? Well, they broke all these rules and they decided that they didn't want to be here. And I'd say again, what kind of feedback do you think they'd offer you about what you could have done differently for them to stay here and not leave? So I'd continue to ask those questions, continue to push, right? Because my understanding of medical fields, if someone's receiving a treatment and the treatment isn't working, the treatment attunes to the client. We don't expect the client to change their medical diagnosis for the specific kind of care that we're giving them, right? How do we adjust those things? How do we not always rely on everything needing to be evidence-based, when a lot of times those evidence-based practices are only evidence-based because people had access to them, right? People had access to the funding to run those kind of studies. Whenever I look at those kind of things, I find out who was served during this evidence-based study, right? Does it truly represent everyone in that community, or does it represent a small handful, right? Who conducted the study and what did their demographics look like, right? So continuing to ask these questions is how we continue to uproot and attune to folks that might not have the best experiences in our care. And there is a treatment center that I worked with who did make that effort, right? When they asked someone to leave, or if they left themselves, they found them and said, what could we do differently? How do we adjust to what you need? And I understand, again, parameters, right? From the state, from licensure, from insurance, and all those different types of things. But they did what they could. They asked the person how we could be different. What would have been a more safe, nurturing environment for you to explore these things? And they make the adjustments as needed. They bring it to their staff and to their board, and they do those things. Right? I think that's critical, especially now when we talk about folks needing access to care and sometimes not wanting to come in for that extra access because of historical trauma, because of historical distrust of medical communities, right? We work with a number of tribal populations in Wisconsin, and even during the COVID pandemic, I understand not wanting to get vaccinated, right? That historical trauma of a number of atrocities happening, right, is good reason to not want to do that. And it wasn't on me to be like, well, you should do it or you got to do it or whatever, right? Like I could make the adjustments necessary to meet that, right? So these are the kind of things that if we're thinking about these as folks are coming in, seeing the whole person, right? Not just the diagnosis in front of us, not just the thing of like, we got to move you through all these different stages of care. And even the same thing with recovery coaching, right? When I think of the stages of change and what people need to do to move through, I don't necessarily think of it as success or not success, right? Is the person showing up, right? How do I adjust myself and how do I test those things? Any other thoughts or comments regarding this? Messages that you came up with? Right, that's great. Did everybody hear that? Reframe it, ask the person. And again, like appreciative inquiry, being curious, motivational interviewing, of course, like how do we reframe that for the person so that they can see it? And sometimes it's a means of stepping outside of themselves, right? That's great. Other thoughts? We'll move on. Is anybody familiar with Johann Hari, Chasing the Scream, the books that he's written? Maybe a few? No? Yes? Okay. In his second book, I'm changing my computer, but not that. I got to remember there's two of them now. So in this book, Lost Connections, right? Like he goes in depth about the studies and the things that people need to feel like they're connected and that they belong. And again, I highly encourage, like, check this out. There's any number of ways that you can access it. But going into not just like the psychological studies of what people need to feel belonging, he actually has some case studies at the end where he talks about like, this is what a co-op looks like and how people come together and connect with each other. This is a community garden. He has a whole bunch of instances where we can draw from and where we may already see things happening in our communities to build off of. So today, talking about rebuilding belonging and finding connection. How do we build belonging? How do we rebuild it if that's what's needed? Talk about the difference between inclusion and belonging. So when I think this was a couple years ago, I was with an organization called the Privilege Institute and Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. there, who's on, let's see, he'd be your right. He started the Privilege Institute in the mid-90s in Iowa, talking about white supremacy, talking about anti-racism. I cannot imagine, and I've asked him this, like, what is it like to be a black man in the middle of Iowa coming up and saying those kind of things, right? Like, and 26 years later, they still hold it, right? I believe 26 is happening in Seattle. It's called the White Privilege Conference. Again, a number of things that you can learn there, great speakers. But he brought in Rezo Minikon, and his book, Grandfather's Hands, he talks about, will not end white supremacy, white body supremacy, or any other form of human evil by trying to tear it to pieces. Instead, we offer people better ways to belong and better things to belong to. And so, emphasizes that inclusivity often means adding people to what already exists. Diversity from a starting point, right? Diversity being everything what might outside of what we might consider the norm, right? And a lot of times in our culture and the way that a lot of our texts have been written, a lot of the stuff in school has been written, what's the norm? What's the norm? White male, right? Everything else is diversity. Diversity hires, right? Bringing folks in, right? So if that's the norm, right? If I'm the norm and I want to be inclusive, I'm inviting folks in who I have no idea what their experience is and they don't know what mine is and they're not going to benefit from the same things that I have, but yet my expectation and my hope is you feel included. You feel included in my experience. You feel included in my norm. Oops, too far. But understanding that belonging is a place that can create an environment where people can bring their whole selves. And the aspect of belonging that's difficult for me is that I then have to be willing to let go of some of my comfort in order for that to happen for other people, right? Again, for other people to belong, I have to be willing to let go of some of my comfort so that that happens. And of course, I cling to it. Of course, like I struggle with it. Of course, there's any number of things where like, yeah, but do we have to go that far with it, right? Do we really have to change all these things in order for people to feel like they belong? But I know, and I've seen when people do have that, they're able to access more healing inside of them. They don't have to betray themselves. They can truly feel connected to the environment that they're in and what's going on. I'm just going to ask you, does anybody have an experience where they felt true belonging in recovery in their community? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Does anybody have an experience where you felt true belonging? So being open to thoughts, comments, feedback from folks, actually be willing to do some of the footwork to make that change, to be more in community with the folks around you. That's great. Thank you. Other thoughts, comments, experiences of feeling belonging. It's always interesting when I go to conferences or events like this, right? Like, again, I understand there's certain like social norms and there's expectations. We all were like thinking like, what am I going to wear? How professional do I need to go today, right? Our funder's going to be there, right? Like I got to think of all these things before I come in. And does that create, an atmosphere of belonging for folks, right? What do we set up for folks when they come into even work? And like, because this is messy work. Like humans are really messy and all over the place sometimes. And even for me, like it's like this struggle, like, well, how do you just kind of make it like nice and concise and fit into whatever needs to be fit into? But again, like, are we asking folks to betray themselves as they do that, right? So I have a few thoughts on some strategies. And of course, I changed the slides, so I'm looking at something completely different. But on mine, there's this quote that says, social change is 1,000,000 individual acts of kindness. Cultural change is 1,000,000 subversive acts of resistance. And that's Mary Pfeiffer who said that. For me, when we talk about recovery support services, I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with these, but this came from a colleague of mine, Bob Carty, who kind of broke down these 4 types of recovery support services. Emotional, so examples, the recovery coaching, peer support groups, right? Like really connecting with that person. Safety for emotional expression. We talk about informational support, and this, again, one of those key factors when it comes to information. Just yesterday, I was talking with a friend of mine and says, you know what, we've got phones. We've got access to all the resources we could ever want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're good resources, right? So in training and talking to folks in the community, oftentimes we're asking, is that a place that you would send a family member? And I would say it depends upon the family member, right? Like they're going to get it's a mixed bag. But knowing how to navigate the resources and walk with a person throughout those things, again, one of those aspects of recovery support services that I truly admire. Instrumental support, removing barriers that may block recovery, and again, understanding that everyone's barriers are going to be different, right? For some folks, it might be, a mother with kids. How do we expect her to go to treatment for 28 days when there's no place for her kids, right? Are we developing those environments? I think with our community in Appleton, Wisconsin, we just opened up a facility where moms could bring their kids in and attend, and daycare was available right there on the spot, right? Small things like that. How are we attuning? How are we removing barriers? And how are we listening to the communities and the individuals to find out what their specific barriers are? Affiliational support, social connection and identity formation. Decreased isolation and stigma, offers recovery and wellness and related fun. I think that's really important. Replacing, there's a book from William White, and I think it's a little bit like dated, but he talks about 7 cultural aspects of like active substance use culture, and then what needs to be changed over into 7 aspects of recovery culture, right? And he talks about these bridges of all these different things, and the timelines that they go on are all different. But it's important for folks, and within the 12-step communities and different recovery communities, they're pushed for like, make sure you're going to social gatherings and meetings and sharing. But there's an aspect too, when we talk about attunement and belonging, as we are now seeing a lot of conversation talking about neurodiverse communities, right? Or as my wife likes to say, neurospicy communities. perhaps someone, and we continue to push the idea that they need to be a part of groups, what if they're not charged by being in groups, right? What if they are someone who's more of an introvert? And what if there's someone that needs to just like have that smallness in order to like really feel like they're doing what they need to do? What if their pathway of recovery is just knitting? Can we accept that, right? Can we move into an environment where that's just fine for where they are at and not have these other expectations of non-compliance? You're not going to enough meetings. You don't have a sponsor yet, right? Doesn't work for everybody that way. How are we connecting with where they're at, and how are you asking those questions? It's great, again, a number of recovery support services here in Michigan. What I want to share, though, is this community health worker model that happened in Rwanda. They created a national network of 45,000 community health workers, assigning 3 of them to every village to ensure local access to health support and suicide prevention services. They're chosen from within their own communities. Between 2006 and 12, they saw a 38% reduction in suicide rates. The model built deep trust within the communities, an example how equipping resources and communities to care for their own, right? And I believe like the peer recovery support services, the structures that we build there draw from and do these exact kind of things, right? And how do we continue to rely on that? Because one of my aspects of this when talking to folks is like, yes, they're going to have the 28-day treatment, but what are we doing beforehand and what are we doing afterwards? There's a study from the Recovery Research Institute out of Harvard that says for folks with SUD, it takes 10 to 15 years to meet the same level of like social capital as someone who doesn't have an SUD, right? 10 to 15 years. How many services within your arena last for 10 to 15 years, right? How many last 5 years? What are those connections? What do they look like? All right, so I love the collective impact model, and in one of my earliest experiences with it, are folks familiar with the collective impact model? Right, so bigger than just like a coalition, bigger than just an advisory committee, right? Like how do we get hundreds of places to kind of go towards the same goal? We had the Fox Valley Substance Abuse, it was a little dated, coalition back in 2013 and 14. We're using the 4 pillars structure model of treatment, law enforcement, harm reduction, and prevention, right? Recovery hadn't even made it underneath that yet. And so each one of those pillars gathered several agencies and organizations, right? Where I worked at the time, Harmony Cafe, we served as the backbone of that collective impact model, right? So I was in charge of collecting the notes and making sure everybody got everything and that all of us were talking about the same thing at the same time. What I love about it is that it moves to this level almost like a recovery-oriented system of care, right? ROS models teach us that it's not just about having the treatment centers and recovery centers involved, it's how is the gas station involved? How's the library involved, right? How's the agency and organization that you work for involved? How are the companies where our family members involved? Are they speaking the same language? Do they understand what's going on? How can we get them involved and at the table to engage in a collective impact model? The last one I want to talk about is healing-centered engagement. And for me, and I'll land with this one, healing-centered engagement, there was an article in 2018 from Dr. Sean Ginwright. He was working in the Oakland area, primarily with inner city youth, youth that had experienced a lot of trauma, youth that were still in environments that weren't necessarily conducive to them being able to grow and move. And so they'd host these summer camps, and they continuously ask the kids, like, what happened, and what's wrong, and what's all the deficits in your life, right? One of the youth came up to him and said, like, stop asking all that stuff. Like, I'm so much more than that. I have strengths, right? I have hobbies, I have desires, I have all these things. And so the Healing Center engagement model invites us to shift from just trauma-informed care to broader systemic. What happened in the environment to allow for those traumas to happen, right? How do we address those pieces, right? And how do folks that are working through this become agents of that change, which I think we see in a lot of areas, especially within recovery supports. I myself have been able to be a part of legislative policy and changing some of those things. So healing-centered engagement invites us to think about what's right with you. Not what's wrong with you, what happened to you, but what's right with you. When I was speaking at the Michigan Substance Use Mental Health Conference a few years ago, I brought up the model, and a treatment agency came up afterwards and said, right now our intake process is this. Tell us about all the drugs you've done. Tell us about all the things that have happened in your life. Tell us what brought you here, right? And then at the end of it, they say, well, tell us some good things about yourself. I can say from experience, by that point, I don't know what the good things are about myself, right? So how do we reverse that? Think about it. How do you start with what's right with you and then ask a person what happened and what did you do that covered some of that up, right? I believe at the end of the day, all folks have inherent worth and dignity. There were environments that covered some of that up, that distorted some of that, and my job, is to help people find that again. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure we're going to have the slides come out, and we're going to take a break, or you got to say something first?
Oh, that's it.
Okay, that's it. Okay.
My name is Taylor Greenfield. I'm the Director of Development at Arbor Circle. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our next presenter is Phil Chvojka, pronounced Chvojka. I've been practicing. Phil is a department specialist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, where he has dedicated more than 25 years to advancing data systems and accountability in behavioral health. His work has helped track treatment access, monitor outcomes, and inform statewide strategies for substance use services across all 83 Michigan counties. With a background in teaching and statistics, Phil brings both technical expertise and a deep commitment to ensuring data tells the real story of people seeking care. Today, he will share insights into recent data trends, particularly around treatment access and outcomes in West Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Phil Chvojka.
Thank you. Actually, I should clap for you and not the other way around, because you do something for 25 years and realize that you're like a non-essential state employee, that the work that you do and the work that you get and the data that you get to me allows me to do what I do. Again, now, so if you do something for 25 years, you might have a document that is 21 years old. And I want you to have this. And what this document I'm going to bring up here is primary substance by county for all 83 counties, from 2005 to 2025. So ideally, this is one that we did put on the web for a while, but we've taken it back because I got concerned that some of the smaller counties were not being represented as far as that goes. But this is something that I do want you to have. It's not something I'm going to go over now, but it is something that if you look at it and you say, hey, wait a minute, there's more things that I want to know about that, then we have the opportunity to just contact me. So I have this. Again, there's my slide for me, Phil Chvojka. If you want anything by any of these levels, statewide, by PHP, I can do it by selected counties, whatever it may be, from what you see in there, just send me the email and I will get back to you with what I can run for that. That's part of my job. That's what I'd like to do as my job. When I get those requests in, it allows me to get into the data and dig at it even more so with that. So that's me, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And the 26 years go by pretty fast. In fact, when I started, our speaker, Jim Haveman, was the director when I started. So, the TEDS directives we're going over is a hybrid of federal and state fields. What we have with it is we capture something at admission and discharge, and you know what's part of that, to kind of track outcomes and go forward from that one. It is the key client demographic record that we have at MDHHS, so it's used pretty widely for that. And obviously, when we collect the primary, secondary, and tertiary in it, we do what we have in that document that I just shared. This is the self-serve web page for how we convey what we have in the system. And in fact, if you click on it, I gotta go here. You'll see that it is a page that brings up the reporting requirements, and halfway down it, we have the BH TEDS that conveys everything we want to convey to you in terms of filling it out. So again, we get halfway there, BH TEDS. The coding instructions are here. That Carol Heitzel works on, and we have that in place for that. And from it, you can, any of the fields that need to be answered, you can use this to do that. So it works pretty well. We've got the the table of contents. So you pick anything you want to do. We're going to do time to treatment a little bit later. You click on it and we'll have all the explanation that needs to be with that for how these get answered. And again, I think people do a very good job with that. We do have trainings for that as well. So this becomes one place to get that. And then the other thing that we can do with that, besides the coding instructions, is we have a nice detailed, what we call the color-coded field requirements that are right here. And this shows which ones are the federal and which ones are the state fields. It shows which ones are the national outcome ones that we measure with that. And later today, we'll be dealing with the time to treatment, or excuse me, retention from service start date to end date. But this is in 3 pages, shows the content that's in that. And again, if you have data questions that you want answered, or things you want run, every one of these I have with that. In fact, I will show you on the next slide, I have millions of records. So since I started in 1999, I just ran this on October 12th, 3,743,840 combined admission and discharge records, one each, for 1.5 million unduplicated persons. And there's a lot there. That's a lot. That's 70, 80,000 a year. It is reducing in the last couple of years, and that's one of the trends we'll talk about with that. But when I talk about a large N size, when I talk about I'm going to pull this from more than this year's data, it comes from that. So we have that much to pull from. And again, you to thank for actually taking the time and effort to do that. We're going to limit the size of it going forward. We're trying to pare it down a little bit because we realize it can be sometimes a little bit too much to collect with that, but it's so useful as a record that other people in MDHHS say, hey, can you get us this? Can you add this? Can you add this? And we've stopped doing that with that. So one of the promises I can give to you right now is it's not going to increase in terms of scope because we're getting what we want from that. I'm going to make a comparison in the next couple of slides between Lakeshore region and statewide. And I wanted to show you what makes up the Lakeshore region. So we're going to have side-by-side comparisons looking at different factors for that. These are the counties of residents from the Lakeshore region. This is fiscal year 2025, the fiscal year that just ended a couple of days ago, a couple of weeks ago. And in it, of course, you will see that Kent, Muskegon, and Ottawa make up 83% of the content or of the persons receiving the services. I do like that I see other counties because there are some PHPs that they only serve people that are in their region because of county of financial responsibility, COFR stuff. But in this case, when you do see persons that might need the treatment or might need, and especially when I say access that we'll get to, right away, the looking at that shows that this is the way that this should go. And then I'll just show you then in the next slide what we have in terms of who is the providers that are part of the mix. And one of the nice things, of course, in Michigan, the provider ID that you get, the license goes by the count. The county code are the first 2 digits. So the providers that are in the mix of the Lakeshore region for this, what we're looking at here, obviously Allegan is up front. I tried to color code the ones in the county. I sometimes forget that Berrien County is southwest and not Lakeshore, but I color coded that one. But as you piece through it, you can actually see the counties where the providers are involved. The 15, that's Charlevoix. The 17, that's Chippewa and Sault Ste. Marie. You've got Emmett County in 24. All the 28s are Grand Traverse, the Addiction Treatment Services. The 33s are my county, Ingham. You come back to the 37, that's a new one. Bear River Bellows, that's in Mount Pleasant in Isabella County. You'll see all the 39s are Kalamazoo. And then the majority that are in Kent County, all the ones that start with 41, including Arbor Circles with its 883, and everyone else that's in the mix with that. You get the Sacred Heart that's at the bottom. That's our biggest statewide provider and kind of a state one as far as that. But they're in the mix, as well as the Great Lakes Recovery that's up in the UP. And the one that I haven't read is what seems to be the only adolescent residential that we're looking at in the state at all. At one point we had some at Wedgwood, and I do see some 17-year-olds that maybe round up to 18 to get into some treatment, but the access, the providers that are available to do that are fairly limited at this point. We've got Midland that's there, and all the 61s are Muskegon. So you can see that again as from the regions with the parts that are part of that. The CPI is in Oakland. We've got, and then the Ottawa County, And I just learned that Reach for Recovery I had a different name in for it before, but Reach for Recovery. So these are the ones that are in the mix as far as that goes, with the final one over in Detroit, the OTP, Quality Behavioral Health. So the 5823 are made up of those counties and these providers. And what I did is I put them essentially side by side in some slides so you can observe them and look at that. The one thing that's interesting, people have looked at this is Michigan, 61,000 for the last fiscal year. People say that sort of looks like the Lower Peninsula. You can kind of see that if you can see Lake Michigan coming up, you see the thumb. But the interesting about it is there is that bump in the 50s. There is that bump that goes from where you can see the median age is 41, and since the standard deviation is 12, it's between 29 and 53 is the majority. But that slight little bump where people that get into, and I took a look and saw that it was mostly male, mostly alcohol, and maybe the second or third episode. But I like to make observations about that and be observant and not judgmental about that. But sometimes I will see something and I don't quite know what's in the mix, and I'm welcome to the people at some point, giving their interpretation of why we might see, as opposed to a normal distribution, we see that bump. And if we go to just Lakeshore, that's the smaller population. So this is the 5,800 with there. I did put the normal curve on there so we can see that, but you can also see that still sort of looks like the Lower Peninsula of Michigan with that bump, that slight bump that doesn't follow the normal distribution in the ages of 50. And I'm always curious about why that happens. A little bit younger in terms of Lakeshore, but typical to what we have seen across most of it, with the slight decrease that is occurring with admission. So when I put them side by side, I just want you to take a look and we can kind of see what is similar and what is different, sort of like one of these things and not like the other. By the way, when Jesse said that people remember the first 15 minutes of a presentation and the last 15 minutes of one, if you do 30 minutes, it seems like people remember everything. But so that might be the solution, just do a 30-minute presentation. What you see here, though, what shows evidence is methamphetamine. And again, this is a subset of the 62,000. So this is not Lakeshore versus everyone else. When I do a statewide, it includes everything. So the 5,800 is in the 61,000. But you'll see with methamphetamine with the 16.3%, as compared to statewide, is probably the biggest difference that's in place there. What I like to always see, since you can report a primary, a secondary, or a tertiary, is first of all, how many secondaries are reported? So we go to the next slide, you will see in Lakeshore that 43% or so, or 42.3% do report a secondary with a secondary drug, and statewide it is more than half that report that. One of the differences that I would see with that is that if we go back here, the first one, going back to the primary, if you look at marijuana for Lakeshore, on the right-hand side, marijuana at 4.9%, we typically see marijuana as a secondary or a tertiary drug, and that's a higher percentage that is primary. So that's one of the reasons why when you go to secondary, you will see it statewide, you will see it typically 13.7% versus the 8.9% means it's more often being reported as a secondary as opposed to a primary in the other states, but it's fairly similar. And then the final one I look at is how many do report a tertiary. So we go to the third of the mix with that. Statewide, we got like 21.6%, the opposite of 78.4 that do report a tertiary, and you can't report a tertiary unless you have a secondary. That's how it works. You have to have all three to do that. If it skips, so you say it's a primary and a tertiary, it will be aired out and it needs to get fixed when it comes to the state. But again, with that, what we usually see, and if I were a betting person, and I am not, I don't like the sports gambling and the things that are taking over with some of the kids, which is concerning with the sidebar. But obviously, what I would see is marijuana as the primary, as the number one tertiary, and it is in both places, but I would typically see more like the 6.1%. But bottom line is the single biggest difference. It doesn't happen in cocaine or it doesn't happen in the heroin and the prescription opiates anymore. We see that difference in methamphetamine, West Michigan, Southwest Michigan versus the rest of it. So that's the TSA. We're going to be talking about time to treatment. I want to spend a little bit of time with this slide as well. So this is fiscal year 25. On the left-hand side, again, is Michigan. On the right-hand side is Lakeshore. And since this is not categorical data, we can do math with it. We can figure out a mean, a median, and a mode. Good news, and we'll talk about there, is that the mode, the most frequent one in both of them, is 0. and we want to, and we'll talk about how that relates to retention at the back end of that. What we do see, though, is a slight difference in time to treatment with the mean and the median. And the median is probably a better measure with that, but 4 days in Lakeshore amongst all the providers that are there, and we can run it by provider if we want to. I still like the bigger end size. 4 versus 2 is a difference. And when you go to the bottom, you look at the cumulative percents as they go there, you really see it in the 1 day treatment. You can see 31% versus 28 is fairly similar for the same day, but the next day there's 16% that's put in the statewide as opposed to just the 10.1. And that's where the separation ensues, to where by the time we get to 10 days, and we're going to look at all 3 of those later, we're going to look at same day, 1 day wait, or less than 10 as a immediate, as a urgent, and as a routine. And you can see that 75% statewide, and the left-hand side, the statewide, they get to that in 7 days. So statewide, there's 75% that are within 7 days. But then I'm starting to see that making distinction between 6 days, 7 days, 13 days, 9, they really don't have the same impact as the single day. But I would say that as something to look at, trying to bring that median and mean time to treatment down would be a positive thing in the Lakeshore region. I have been tracking integrated treatment. Now you can see the comparison here with Michigan, basically 50% as either integrated, where they're dealing with both issues of mental health and substance use at the same setting, versus co-occurring, which is just a condition of the person, but it's not being treated as such in both settings. The 19.8% you see on the right-hand side in integrated treatment for Lakeshore, I think is more indicative of what probably should be reported. I think the 13.9% statewide is an underreporting. It might be a measurement error. But typically in the system, the fact that 50% have a co-occurring issue as a part of treatment, and the fact that a majority of them are being treated with integrated treatment, and integrated treatment is increasing. In fact, we're seeing more of it. This year we saw 7,000 integrated treatment, or 7,700 integrated treatment that were mental health admissions, and they do report the primary, secondary, and tertiary, but it's not as a licensed and accredited substance use facility that would do that. So we kind of almost need to put that in the mix, especially when I'm describing all of the treatment that is being done in Michigan. The living arrangement is I'm going to mention about 6 times that 30.6%. That 30.6% homeless that's on the left-hand side for Michigan, that is the highest percentage I've ever seen looking at the data for 26 years. Some years it's as low as 10 or 11%. And because I think it's foundational to what needs to be accomplished, because I think it is sometimes determinant, it is certainly something that impacts what happens, impacts outcomes, impacts retention, all sorts of things. You mentioned and I'll have a slide on economic vulnerability coming forward, and that is certainly part of that. And again, some people say, well, that's Detroit, that's Southeast Michigan, that's where it is. And it's true, but we also noted that in the region here, a quarter, 24.4%, which is high. And again, are there racial disparities in that? Yes, there are. And that's one of the factors that go through all of this. When things get reported, such things such as homelessness or unemployment, and those that we will see racial disparities in that when we check that with the chi-squares. So that's the living arrangement, with homelessness being probably in the current data, the single biggest concern that I see in terms of a red flag, in terms of a warning of things that go deeper than just the treatment that's taking place. This is one that I do. I was curious about the amount of injection. So this is primary route administration injection. I was seeing the methamphetamine versus heroin, because I used to assume, well, it mostly will be heroin. And it's fairly similar across the board, but the 31.5% injection of methamphetamine on the right-hand side in Lakeshore is certainly is different than what I used to expect in this type of measure. But we track routes of administration and injection because of its health implications is one that we pay attention to. I do not show discharge reason to anyone, but any people other than people that actually reported, because there's a misnomer out there. They want simple solutions to kind of a silly success failure, and I don't like that dichotomy of everything. Oh, you got to decide which of these 61,000 were successes and which ones were failures. And I don't like to do that because I have to tell them that the dropped out or left against staff advice doesn't mean that no goals were met. Doesn't mean that it was a waste of time or a waste of public dollars to do that. So it used to be like, we used to call it, AMA or against staff advice, and now it's gone to dropped out because that's the federal term for it. But the 25.2%, especially when you track that with things like retention, and even if you were to look at goals achieved when maybe people feel that they're continuing with no benefit, but there was benefit. So the other one that I would point, you see the 0.2%, the 104 deaths, the 17 in the region. I looked at the median age and the average age of those 17 deaths, and the median average age is 41, with a range from 23 to 60, and I'm 59. And it's the same thing you'll see in that one. In fact, for doing it for 26 years, it totals up to about 7,500 deaths with, again, median age right around 40. And that's the same median age of people that are part of treatment. But that shows, the importance. It shows the stakes that are involved with that. In fact, I sometimes see, as someone that's not clinical, that is a statistician, I sometimes see someone, and I don't even know how they are alive based on the statistics, based on the years of use of like the heroin. It's incredible. So the survival skills that are out there sometimes shows through in the data with that. And then this is the part that I really wanted to come to talk about more than that. So that's kind of sharing, what we see and comparing the regions. I want to do some historical observations in some current years that are more generalized with that, using the big ends. And then I want to talk about this wait time and retention study that we've been doing, where we have found that that immediate treatment, not having to wait, does have an impact on retention. And we're going to try to expand the study as well. And I'll show you that in a little bit. So the historical observations, this is when I say it's the big N size. Remember, it was 3 million records, 1.5 million persons. Very interestingly, that 2-to-1 male to female ratio is consistent every year. Sometimes it'll be as much as like 70-30, but typically the percentage of males is in the 60s, the percentage of females is in the 30s, and that ratio is 2-to-1. That is for every female that's admitted, we see twice as many males. I would describe the system over the course of the years as an adult treatment system. Adolescents, that's 14 people out of every 1,000. That'd be about one person in the room right now. And I don't know if there's served maybe in other systems like school counselors, other places that are there, but that is one of the things that I see that does concern me in terms of, again, when I was the 8th grade teacher, I did have a student that died from a huffing incident at age 14. And I've ever since then, it's kind of like, what is being done to deal with adolescents? And it's kind of nationwide, but our penetration rates to persons ages 18 and younger aren't where they need to be. And in some regions, they're and I don't want to be judgmental about that, they are extremely low, where it looks like there's nothing in the systems for persons that are under the age of 18. But it is an adult treatment system. One of the concepts that's out there is that all of this is like CJ referred. It all comes from drug courts. It all comes from probation officers and that sort of thing. But the majority of referral source through the millions have been self. And when I say less than 20%, it's but more than 19. But about 19% are criminal justice referred as part of the mix. And it's interesting when you start to look at that sometimes like CJ referral and retention, and we'll see that again, that it might have the opposite effect of what some people might assume they are. We have seen a precipitous decline, cut in half, not just in the counts, but the percentage of pregnant women admitted into treatment. I do not know if that's because there's declining birth rates. I think there may be part of the mix with that. But I think sometimes getting the buprenorphine from a script outside the system might be part of the mix. But we are seeing admissions decrease. But we are 367 women reported pregnant. We sometimes used to have like 1,200 in a given year for reporting that. So there's a decrease in women reporting as pregnant at admissions. And again, that fourth one, or the second to the bottom, we have and it might be because of CCBHCs, it might be because of the prospective payment that they get. We're seeing an increase in mental health integrated. So they have an M record. They're reported through the CMHs, not as a substance abuse admission, but as a mental health admission. but they say it is integrated or co-occurring, and they list the primary drugs. And in fact, because of that, I'm going to need that document that we started with that has 21 years on it. I think I need to get those 7,500 or 7,700 into the mix and not out of the mix with that. And the final one is that wait times do stay pretty consistent over the 20 years that we've been tracking it. It's just reported as in days time to treatment from first request, with 75%, which is what we saw in the slide that had Michigan only, 75% within 7 days, 30% with that same day zero wait, and the goal to kind of increase that 30% and get the 75% within 7 days and a little quicker would be something that we would look to pursue. In fiscal year 25, these are kind of the big picture stuff. I've already hit on some of those, but there is a recent reduction in admitted that continues. I had a discussion with the provider on the east side of the state who is very concerned about his viability of staying open, because he's saying, I'm not getting the referrals, I'm not being able to fill the beds, I'm not able to do that. And so the reduction, we've gone from like 75,000 to 61,000 in terms of statewide admissions. And they're saying, well, it's the impact of other types of things, of OBOTs, and where systems where we don't have this rich a data as we do because we do BH-TEDs. And I've had meetings where I've been in there and I've been representing the PIHPs, and we have representatives of the mental health plans. We've got representatives of the OBOTs, and I'm able to talk about the things I can talk about because we have BH-TEDs, and they don't have it. So when I ask them, like, well, how many people have secondary benzos? And they can't answer it, but I can. And they come back and say, well, how can you do that? And the answer is BH-TEDs. That's why I can do that. And that's, again, I appreciate all the efforts that people do to get that in so that we can have that. My solution would be to have more people collect it and not to have us continue to do it while they don't. But it makes it hard sometimes to make comparisons. I made the third point on methamphetamine as a primary is reemerging. It certainly has. There was a peak and a little bit of a waning, and now the ebb and flow, it is increasing and reemerging with that. That fourth one, assessing the scope of MOUD with those OBOTs who don't report TEDs, knowing that I see graphs where it's increasing over time, but I don't know much about them to make those types of comparisons. But I do think that's some of the things that's taking a bite into the amount of admissions that are taking place with that. In 2025, we appear to have one and only one adolescent residential provider. That's the one up in Negaunee, that Great Lakes Recovery. It is almost like a service that is close to non-existent, but the fact that there were 4 referrals in the region this year to get there, I think is a bonus. I sometimes see none. I'm seeing entire regions, 15, 20 county regions that don't have one single adolescent admission. And we have seen some providers that will take someone that's 17, round up to 18 and put them in an adult one as far as that goes, when they try to match their ASAM level to what they should be getting. And it says it should be residential care with that. So that's kind of a lack that's in place there. And again, that final one is what I realize now in preparing for this and thinking about how to talk about this, I'm going to need to change what I do and include the integrated M records where they report their primary, secondary, tertiary. So we tell a more broad picture of who is getting served and what the primary, secondary drugs are and what public dollars are paying for with that. So that will be, that document that was 21 years old where you can pick your county. Oh, I'm going to pick, Kent County and say, okay, see where it's going. I'm going to maybe even have to rework about the last 3 or 4 years to get that in the mix, because I think we're missing a part of that because of that. So the final thing in the summary before I get to what we're going to the study that we're doing is I think this slide is important to understand that the data that we receive are for people that don't have an ability to pay. So the first one is the statement is persons funded in whole or in part with MDHHS administered funds. The biggest fund now is the Medicaid expansion, the Healthy Michigan Plan. In my 25 years, the Medicaid expansion was the single biggest positive that went forward to take kind of pressures off that block grant and kind of fund the system, the publicly funded system more fully. Obviously, with that HR 1, with some of the notions that are in place for reducing eligibility for that, there is the exemption for diagnosis for substance abuse and for substance abuse providers. I think that's great. I still think what I've seen with Medicaid expansion, the idea of rolling it back is beyond unwise. But with that and with Medicaid, that's MA, and with the block grant, it shows that persons have a demonstrated lack of ability to pay. So it's people that are, self-pay or have third parties aren't in the mix for the data that we look at. In fact, the median income is zero. With 61,000 people, it means over 30,000, report no means of legal income. And if you do it arithmetically, it only goes up to 6,500. And some of that people say, oh, okay, that's part of, making sure that people become eligible for that. But it's still, when you look at the homelessness at 30%, when you look at only 14% that are employed, 66% unemployment rate amongst the population. The final one I would say is there's very little evidence of dependable, steady, reliable legal income. And if there was one thing, as someone who looks at the data, if you had a magic wand, it's like, I would like to see more persons have access to legal, dependable, steady income. And I say that as someone who's had a steady paycheck like for 30 years. Every 2 weeks, boom, boom, boom. And still economically, you're like, how are we going to pay for, I got to pay for this sewer. We had trees get on our ladder, only had to pay like, $16,000 to fix the road, but emergencies and things that come up are just paying for, food security and those types of things become issues with that. So that is what we see with that. And it is, it's been there since we've started tracking this. And TEDS started in 1988 as a demo, as a demonstration, and Michigan was part of it. In 1992, it became a federal one. If you hear me say TEDS, I'm referring to the federal part of it. If I say TEDS, I'm referring to what Michigan collects with it. But they essentially mean the same thing. But TEDS itself is a national system. It means like you can also go onto a website, log in as a citizen of Michigan in the block grant website, and compare Michigan's performance measures like increases in employment, reduction in use, attendance at self-help groups. You can compare them nationally because it is a national system as far as that goes. The NIATEX 4 aims, I've been working with NIATEX, and that's out of University of Wisconsin-Madison, another Wisconsin one. And I did live in Wisconsin for 3 years, so there's a couple of Wisconsin ties as far as that goes. I lived up in Rhinelander in northern Wisconsin. That's where I was the 8th grade teacher, where the young man named James died when I was in 1994, and that was tough for me. Especially it just felt like a failure. It felt like you're trying to I was busy teaching them how to divide by fractions and that sort of thing, and kind of missed some stuff with that. But 2 of them are reduced. We want to reduce the wait times. We want to reduce the no-shows. 2 of them are increase the admission and increase the continuation. Most of the work that I have done with it is the continuation, where you look within like 34 days, did you get to your 4th outpatient session? I really like the measure. I say the more that I've looked at that first month is crucially important, that there aren't the no-shows in the midst. So does it take you 28 days to get to 4, or does it take you 45 days to get to 4? And that points itself to other outcomes as far as the MEX. I always felt like reducing wait times, well, yeah, I think that would be a good thing. I didn't think it was that impactful, and now I'm finding that I was wrong, because we're doing a study right now, and this is Dr. Alsab and I and Sarah are working on that. And I also get a shout out to Carl Pearson, who in 1900 developed the chi-squared test, which is how we start to see the comparisons between categorical data to see this. And what we did is we created a study with 3 groups, 3 what are called exposure groups. And I guess I should get to the limitations first. We're going to try to expand this. This was done basically with OTP, so that's why there's 5,500 in the mix. We want to expand it to include recovery support services, and we want to do it more than just did you have an admit date and a discharge date that was 180 days, but if there's recovery housing, if there's recovery services, if there's peer services, to try to see who is from a start is getting 180 days of ties to the system with that. We want to use the source to be the TEDS lengths of stay and the procedure codes. What I am finding sometimes is that some of the recovery coaching, some of the peer services that would be in H0038, as we're looking in the encounter systems for that, they are getting done, but they don't show up that way because it's being paid or done for in a different manner. And the T10-12s we also treat as recovery support. And those as well sometimes are missed with that. But that's those limitations aside, we're essentially looking for how long did you wait, and did it, and what was the outcome in terms of retention within those days. And so we do that with odds ratios and relative risk ratios. And you can say the exposure that we're talking about are the wait times in days, and that's the three groups. We're looking at three groups with that. Zero wait, that's it. So zero, it's a zero wait, or you did wait some. We have 1 day, 0 or 1, that we call our urgent. So did you wait 1 day or 0 days versus everyone else? And then we did 10 days. So it's within 10 days or longer than 10 days, and you'll see what we found with that. And when we do the odds and the risk ratios, the calculations are fairly similar. One is a ratio of ratios. So the odds ratio is a ratio of a ratio, or a quotient of a ratio. The other is a ratio of a percentage or a proportion. But the A's, B's, C's, and D's do mean something. They don't just, it's not randomly put in place with that in these studies. And here's the slide for that. So an A is someone who's exposed to the risk factor, and we'll just use zero weight. So we're looking at those people that had zero weight versus those that had some weight. The A's are the people that had zero weight and met the threshold for 180 days. So that's what an A is. Yes, yes. They immediate treatment that day, met the standard. The B's are the people that had immediate treatment but did not meet the standard. Then you go down to the C's. The C's are the ones that met the standard, but they had a longer wait time, and the D's are the ones that had neither. And that's how we can do those ratios and get to what the findings that we can see with that. And this is just the chi-squared formula. It looks pretty fancy, but it's just an observed minus the expected. And I'll show you a slide about what we mean by observed and expected in statistics. But if it's like, temperatures, like today's expected temperature is 60 degrees. If it's 53, that would be 7 less, -7. When you square a negative, it becomes positive. So you can actually get a positive value with that and decide if something happens by chance, if something happens, or if there's an association between the two. And we'll look at those associations for other factors besides wait time. And so that's what we'll finish with that. The no delay versus the delay, and obviously it's the risk, and risk there is a good thing. It's the risk of staying more than 179 days, or the risk of having that retention. You will see that, you can see the percentages that are in place there. The risk ratios and the confidence intervals suggest that it is statistically significant. That means clients who started immediately are more likely to stay 179 days compared to those with a delay. Statement, immediate treatment seems to increase the long-term retention. That was, again, something that I wasn't expecting. I thought it would be a little bit more random than that, or a little more scattered, but we are finding in the study that we did that was the case, that zero weight is an important predictor for that. When we expanded it to 1 day, so we call this urgent, this includes 0 and 1. So the zeros are still in there. You can see the numbers as we crunched that. We did the same thing. We did the risks and the odds. We got borderline significance, and a p-value. The higher it is, the more insignificant it is. The higher it is, the more random they are. But the interpretation with 1 day is that starting within 1 day shows a trend towards higher term retention, but the effect is weaker and it misses conventional significance. But it suggests a benefit, but less robust than the strict 1 day cutoff. And then when we went to 10 days routine, it all disappeared. It disappeared. In fact, it went the other way at 41.3% versus 40.6%. But you start within 10 days, the impact on long-term retention is that the benefit seems to dissipate and not be there. And so this is the slide that we have on that preliminary study, which says that the most impactful is immediate. There's some benefit for the 1 day, but when it starts to be more than 1 day, and you try to say, well, did you get in within 10 versus more than that, those vanishes different. So it's different. The differences vanish, and we're going to try to expand this study beyond what we've originally done with that. And this again is just I like to show people this, how chi-squared works, because sometimes I'll use the word expected and they won't understand what I'm talking about. Obviously, it's a crosstab of sex at birth of the 367 this year women who were pregnant, and chi-squared would expect men to be pregnant because it doesn't know that only women can get pregnant. It would say, since there's a ratio of 2 to 1, we would expect to see twice as many men as women being pregnant. We know that doesn't happen, and that is why when everything gets crunched with this, the chi-square values are huge. with the degrees of freedom of 2, and it says, no, there's no chance that this is happening happening randomly. There is a dependency between the two with that. But the issue can become is someone would say, well, I expect the women to be pregnant. I don't expect the men to be pregnant. But chi-squared, in looking at those types of relationships, doesn't do that. It's just crunching the numbers. What we did then beyond that is we started looking, am I running out of time? Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll do this very quickly then. We found a relation. We found the older that someone is, yes, the more likely to stay. So by age, age impacts the hitting the standards. Females are more likely than males, and it's statistically significant because the p-value is less than 100th. Race, ethnicity, it seems like always that is a factor, especially with the Hispanic. The missing is 88%, but the small n size of 52 is taken care of with the chi-squared. But there are differences within race. The education level is the one thing there isn't. If you see that one, that's a 0.3. That means anyone, if some high school, college grads, that is happening more by chance. It isn't a factor in terms of hitting that retention level. These two always are a factor when we're looking at outcomes, the stability of employment, the stability of housing. If you look at that unstable housing at 21%, that's half of who makes the standard as far as that goes. And having some stability, even if you lost it, or having some employment, if you went from having it to losing it, is more than having the instability as far as that goes. And then we did see that 3 or more prior treatments makes one less likely to hit the standard. And that's one of those ones where I see it and I observe it. I don't necessarily understand why, and I could look into it more, but there was a relationship there. Referral source has that in place, and obviously whether or not someone is methadone was another big factor in terms of predicting it. But the takeaway from that, and there's the bottom final study of the 5,400 we're going to try to expand. The takeaway is the 0-day wait impacts in ways that I didn't intend them to, but it certainly shows across the board. And that's what I have.
Don't leave yet, Phil. Stay here. Let's do some Q&A. So a huge thank you again to Phil. Thank you, thank you. So we do have just a couple minutes for a question or two. If there is one in the audience, we have a mic somewhere that can come to you if you would like. And we can turn it over to Phil and Jesse to answer a couple questions.
Yeah, if they ever have a data-related one, they can always email it. Always.
So I had a question about employment because when we have the steady income that absolutely can help people's lives, but then they stop qualifying for Medicaid and then they lose their services or they are expected to pay. So
one of the things I tried to look at was other ways in which people get legal income, like whether they get UI, unemployment insurance. You know, we've got 66% that get unemployment, but only 26% that appear to get the unemployment insurance, which is interesting with that. But I certainly can be a factor that increases those that are either out of the workforce or unemployed, a disincentive to do it. Is it women's specialty service? And the child mothers and the child care should be covered. It should be. It is not being covered. Oh, in residential. Well, there's money available in the block grant for women's specialty because more people have gone to Healthy Michigan Plan, so we meet our match for that. There should be money available to cover that.
So one of the issues that I've seen with my clients is yes, you have these programs, but the accessibility is so difficult. They have to jump through so many hoops. Some of the case managers and DHS are not familiar with it. They get denied. It's very, very exhausting for clients in an early recovery, trying to get that child care piece covered. Is there anything that the government is changing this quarter so that the accessibility is not linked to DHS, but a different way of entering that door to access those resources?
I do not know. but it's again, something to note, but.
My question is for you, Jesse. When you were talking earlier, you were talking a lot about safety. And one of the things that struck me is that sometimes we don't ask people what safety means to them. We make an assumption about what that is based on, our environment or things that we tell staff to do. And I wonder if you had any thoughts or suggestions about how we can open up the discussion about safety, because sometimes it seems like it's kind of put upon them rather than them being asked what it means to them in our environment. Because obviously there's things we can control and things we can't. But I wonder if we ask the question so that we know that enough.
Yeah, that's a great question about safety and whose responsibility is it to create it, and like what are the circumstances. So like I mentioned earlier, drug court, can have this perception of being, a volunteer thing, right? Like you go, right? Like you go to drug court and you go through all these, different courses and you meet with folks, or prison or jail, right? And granted, it's still a choice, right? And then there are a lot of folks that might even say like, well, I'll just go do the time and just, I can do that standing on my head, or like, right? Like I'm used to those kind of environments. So then when it comes to safety, and what I say to folks there too is like, sometimes you have to do what you have to do within the system. And my wife's nonprofit, she works with families who are at the intersection of child protection services and substance use disorder, and helping with reunification processes, right? Like advocating on their behalf. And that's another circumstance where it's like, you're in this situation, right? And you are being handed all these hoops that you have to go through in order to have, reunification with your children. How do you talk about safety in something like that, right? And this small experience I've had and what I've witnessed her do is, it really was like that one-on-one connection and the explanation of what was going on, right? I think part of safety is transparency. Sometimes like the kind of transparency we don't want to do, right? Sometimes a transparency that both shows like, here's what all the exposures of all the things and the unfortunate detriments within, said system or whatever. So I think err on the side of trusting that people are experts of their own experience. Err on the side that there's no such thing as too much information, right? I will absorb what I need to absorb, and I might, those other seeds that you're planting may come into fruition later, right? Sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes 6 months. So building safety, it needs to be co-created, right? Can we co-create safety with our folks? Can we not come to the table with pre-existing understanding of what it is? And then move that even further, right? Like, trauma-informed care, safety, then trust happens, right? And that's how we'll know if there's safety. Do they trust us, right? And I think those things all kind of work hand in hand.
I was just going to add something. When you mentioned not using the term consumers or clients, I've tried to strike that for a couple of years now. You said guests. I just call persons or people. I don't use those terms at all. So I just didn't like them. The client never struck me. That's how it's client level data. So I just say persons.
Well, here we are, end of Thomas J. Bullock Memorial Lecture number 2. So come back for number 3. Thank you, Jesse and Phil, for your thoughtful presentations, and thanks to all of you for being here today and taking the time to learn from one another. That's how we create a strong recovery community. And again, he's not here anymore because I think he went out to breakfast, but thank you to Jim and Barb Haveman for their vision and generosity that makes this lecture possible. We appreciate Jim's comments about the life of Tom Bullock and his dedication to making sure that lived experience remains a critical part of our recovery community. So before you leave, QR code for a survey. We really appreciate your feedback, and especially we want to learn what you'd like to hear next year. If you have suggestions, if you have topics, if you have speakers, we'd love to hear that. It's a little blowy outside. I just noticed that it's kind of raining and it's getting a little bit darker. So as you leave, be careful and drive carefully and come back next year. Thank you.